ETFs continue to grow as one of the most popular ways to easily invest your money and build wealth over time passively. This means that you can have your money work for you by putting in nearly no time at all, because when you invest in ETFs, you are placing your money into thousands of companies, bonds, or other securities where you reap their overall benefits all within one purchase. Which, for those curious, although there are actively managed ones which are controlled by a specific person or company, all the ETFs I'm going to show you in this video are index-based, which means they track a particular segment in the market. Now, the options I'm going to show you in this video are extremely cheap and is why Warren Buffett states a low-cost index fund is the most sensible equity investment for the great majority of investors. And on top of that, by investing into all of the funds I'm about to show you, you would be gaining massive exposure to many different markets. And an exclusive bonus for watching this video until the end is that I'm going to be providing you a real-world portfolio using all of these ETFs that would have actually generated you a 13% average annual return over the past 10 years. And because all this content is free, before I dive deep into things, all I'm going to ask from you is that you kindly hit the like button on this video. With that being said, the first one on my list is the Vanguard Total Stock Market ETF, ticker symbol VTI. Now, VTI seeks to track the performance of the CRSP US Total Market Index, which is an index that contains over 3,500 micro, small, large, and mega cap companies that represent close to 100% of the US investable equity market, which, by looking at Vanguard's site, VTI has 3,861 holdings in the fund. And this fund and all the other funds I'm going to discuss in this video are what's called market cap weighted funds, which means the companies that are inside of the fund are given weight based off of their size. For example, for VTI, the top holdings as of the recording of this video are Apple, which holds 6.52% of the fund, then Microsoft and Amazon thereafter at 5.54 and 2.59%. This is extremely important to know because there is something called fund overlap, which many people and even other YouTubers do not mention or emphasize enough the importance of understanding this concept. But basically, fund overlap kind of explains itself, and you'll get a really good understanding as you continue watching this video, but it basically means that you have similar companies that are within multiple funds that you own. A great example of this is that with Vanguard's S&P 500 ETF ticker VOO, you will see that 99.4% of the S&P 500 holdings are also in VTI. You can also see that between these two funds, they also have an 86% overlap by weight, which means they are extremely identical, and only 14% of VTI's investments are outside of the S&P 500. This is a big factor toward why I'm mentioning VTI in this video, because it is a much simpler way to get much more exposure to the broad US market while still having pretty much the entire S&P 500. And I also want you to be aware of this because I've heard and seen many times where someone has all their investments in VOO and VTI. Because these are so similar, you are pretty much banking on a few identical companies that contain a high weight in their funds, where diversification is not going to be your best friend. Something I learned while getting my MBA is that when it comes to investing, the mindset needs to be to not lose money, or most of it think of it as to make the most amount of money. Although there's always going to be some sort of risk, and you need to be willing to take on risk to actually build wealth. But if you had a portfolio that dropped 35%, that means that you would need to gain back 54% just to break even. And if it went down 50%, you would need to gain 100% back. And crazy enough, if you had something decline 90%, which many stocks have done, then you would need to gain 900% back to break even. I bring this up to make you aware that individual stocks or even one fund as your entire portfolio is probably not the best idea, because if it declines significantly, it is tough to get it all back. And that right there is why I've spent so much time initially planning out how I'm going to allocate all my funds in my portfolio to different types of markets for best diversification. Now, before I go back to giving you more data on VTI, which is the total stock market ETF, I'm going to be truthful with you and let you know that I actually prefer to have the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF, which is VOO. And because the S&P 500 is only large cap companies and VTI is the broad US market, to make up for additional exposure, what I like to do is invest into both the Vanguard Small Cap ETF, VB, and the Vanguard Midcap ETF, VO. I do this because I personally like to track the performance of each of the funds and control how much I actually have allocated to each one. But back to VTI, this ETF comes at a 0.03% expense ratio, which is the cost it takes to own the fund each year. So if you had $1,000 invested into this fund, after a year, you would have paid 30 cents in fees. These fees automatically come out of the fund as you own it and are not going to be charged separately anywhere else. Something else interesting is that you can see the ratio compared to the average expense ratio of similar funds being 0.79%, which makes this fund a much better option for holding long term, and is why I consistently say to be purchasing index funds. Something else that's cool is that if you're a dividend lover, this fund actually pays out a dividend, which can change based on market conditions, but currently yields a 1.42%. On top of that, when I look at funds to invest into, I prefer to look at ones that have at least 10 years of data to look back at history and see how it's performed, and for VTI, it's averaged an annual return of 12.8% over the past 10 years. Besides that, this fund has its highest sector being technology at 30.1%, which primarily comes from many of the large tech companies inside the fund like Apple and Microsoft. Now, when I go to build my portfolio, I always make sure to look at the sectors and top companies that are in the fund to make sure that there's no significant overlap that's obvious. And like I said, buying VTI is the easier way to get exposure to the broad US market, or what you could do like I do is get these small, mid, and large cap funds all separately, which are VB, VO, and VOO if you'd rather. Now that right there is Vanguard's Total Stock Market ETF VTI. Let's now move on to the next one, that is Vanguard's Total International Stock ETF, ticker symbol VXUS. I'm mentioning this one next because this fund seeks to track the performance of the FTSE Global All Cap Excluding US Index, which measures the investment return of stocks issued by companies outside of the US. As discussed, the funds I'm showing you are passively managed from tracking indexes, and what's nice is that this fund gains exposure by both developed and emerging markets. On top of that, this fund has 7,989 holdings, with the top ones being Taiwan Semiconductors and Nestle at 1.52 and 1.1%. Notice how all the companies in this fund have much smaller percentages than the total stock market fund. And the reason I like that is because it prevents extreme exposure to one specific company. And as you can see, the top regions in this fund include Europe at 40.3%, and then the Pacific and emerging markets thereafter. And to make it even more interesting, let's talk about the countries that are inside of it, and they include Japan and the UK at 15.6 and 10%. And when we look at the fund overlap, we can see how there are no similar investments at all between this fund and VTI. Besides that, this fund has a 0.07% expense ratio, so if you had $10,000 invested in the fund, you would pay $7 a year in fees, which is basically the price of a Little Caesars hot and ready pizza. Now, the main page for this doesn't show the dividend yield for the fund where it should, but from scrolling down, it states that they have recently paid nearly 62 cents per share in dividends, which the share price, the market price, is about $56, making that roughly 1.1% of a dividend yield. And for the moment that you've all been waiting for, that I know won't excite you, is the past 10-year performance that has averaged an annual 5% return. Now, I know many of you are thinking that you're not going to get that, and why would I even mention that in this video? Well, just wait until the end when I show you the portfolio that includes this fund, yet still averaged 13% over the past 10 years. Now, just because there's going to be someone saying inflation, you didn't factor that into the play. Well, let's just say it's about 2 to 3%, so subtract that by the 13%, and that's still a great return. But anyways, moving on from there, the next ETF on my list is the Vanguard Consumer Discretionary ETF, ticker VCR. This fund seeks to track the performance of stocks in the consumer discretionary sector. That means companies that manufacture products and provide services that consumers purchase on a discretionary basis. Think of this like buying products or services that you want instead of what you need. For example, there's something called consumer staples, which consist of things you need like food or household items. Then consumer discretionary consists of things you want, like maybe a Tesla or shoes from Nike. For better understanding, the top company that would be in a consumer staples fund would be Procter & Gamble, where the top companies in the consumer discretionary fund are Amazon and Tesla. So because VCR is categorized as domestic stock, let's first check its overlap with the total stock market. Now, it's not surprising to see 98.3% of VCR's holdings are in the total stock market fund, but what's good to see is only 11% overlap by weight. Now, there's no right or wrong overlap as long as you understand the allocations that you have in your portfolio, and if we compare this to the S&P 500's 86% overlap, it is much better. But here's a huge warning that you all need to be aware of. The top 3 companies in this fund are Amazon, Tesla, and Home Depot. Look at the weight each of them have in the fund. If Amazon alone were to go bankrupt and the stock dropped to 0, that means that the entire fund would go down 22%. So like I said, always check the top holdings of the company and see how much weight they actually carry towards the fund's performance. And if you're happy with those companies, then continue on with it. Why not? But from there, the leading sectors in the fund are broadline retail and auto manufacturers at 24.9% and then 18%. Aside from the holdings, this fund costs 0.1% per year to own and has a dividend yield of 0.2% 10.69%. And the best part about it is that over the past 10 years, it has averaged an annual return of 13.28%. And even after going through the '08 recession, since 2004, it has averaged a 10.79%. If you don't understand how good that is, if you had $10,000 invested in 2004 and got a 10.8% average return, that means you would now have turned that into roughly $70,000. And yes, there are factors to consider like inflation, but for this video, I'm generally just giving you this information to let you know how well some of these ETFs can actually do for you. With that being said, let's now move on to the next ETF, that is the Vanguard's Information Technology ETF, ticker symbol VGT. This ETF is beyond my favorite when it comes to looking for the highest potential growth because it has averaged an annual return of 20.65% over the past 10 years. Like, are you serious? That's insane. Now, obviously, this doesn't guarantee any future results, but if you're someone that's had this fund, you probably love it. And if you don't know about it, hopefully this video has made you grateful enough to hit the subscribe button and share this with one friend that may greatly benefit from this video. But back to VGT, this fund seeks to track the performance of stocks in the information technology sector, which includes companies that serve the electronics and computer industries, or as it states, manufacture products based on the latest applied science. For instance, this fund has 323 stocks, with its top holdings being Apple, Microsoft, and Nvidia. Be aware of this crazy statistic because Apple and Microsoft combined cover roughly 42% of the entire fund. And on top of that, it has a 26% overlap by weight with the VTI Total Stock Market ETF. For these reasons, I recommend having a limited amount towards this fund and even the last consumer discretionary one because of how heavily concentrated they are on only a few specific companies. In addition to that, we can also see the sectors are system software, hardware, and storage are among the top ones for this technology fund that makes up roughly 50% of the entire fund. It's honestly so shocking to see how much technology has grown over the past decade compared to previous times, and after watching Ready Player One or any other futuristic movie, it's crazy how much there still is to come. So this fund comes at a 0.1% expense ratio and pays 0.66% in dividends. If you're worried about the expense ratio from any of these funds, just pretend that they're coming from the dividends that are earned. But something else amazing about this is that since 2004, when this fund was created, it has averaged an annual return of 12.88%, and that is through the Great Recession. With that being said, that is the Vanguard Information Technology ETF, VGT. Let's now move on to the number 5 ETF, that is the Vanguard's High Dividend Yield ETF, ticker VYM. I know there are many out there that love dividend investing, and this one could be your dividend king because it currently yields a 3.08%. And as you could guess, this fund seeks to track the performance of the FTSE High Dividend Yield Index, which tracks companies that are forecasted to have above average dividend yields. Now, this fund has 462 stocks, with the top ones being JP Morgan, Johnson & Johnson, and ExxonMobil, each having over 3% weight in the fund. And what I like about this fund is that it provides more exposure to markets like financials, consumer staples, and healthcare, which is great for additional diversification from big tech. And by owning this fund, you are still going to have majority overlap with the total stock market fund, but there is only 31% overlap by weight. But like I said, what I like is that the overlap comes from companies outside of big tech. And just because I love looking at numbers, I want to get even deeper into this, and you can see the comparison where the top 3 companies I discussed earlier, each having over 3% of the fund, but in VTI, they only have about 1%. Diving even deeper on this platform, you can see the separation they have as ExxonMobil adds 2.3% additional weight to VYM, where majority of the weight was lost in this fund because Apple, Microsoft, and other tech companies are not having as much weight in this fund compared to they do in VTI. So going back to VYM, its expense ratio is 0.06%, where I said the current dividend yield is 3.08% with a share price of $108. I mentioned the share price because the dividends are paid out quarterly, and as of the most recent payout, you would have received 88 cents for each share you own, which for those that are complete beginners, when I say quarterly, it means about every 3 months you are going to get your dividends paid out to you. You can also see on the image the history of each dividend payment and how often they pay them. But what's amazing is you're not just getting the overall dividends from the fund, but also the appreciation of the growth of the companies inside of the fund. This has allowed the fund over the past 10 years to have an average annual return of 9.87%, and that's going to include the dividend yield as well. Alright, so now you know 5 options that have done very well over time, and although it doesn't guarantee future results, The next one on my list is one of my favorites because many others don't talk about it, and I think it is extremely underrated, which is the Vanguard's Material ETF, ticker symbol VAW. Now, if you haven't noticed, I try to pay a lot of attention to the diversification of what funds are inside of the portfolio, where many others might just look for the highest growth potentials. And if I'm going to be honest with you, this is one of my favorite on the list because this has only 3% overlap with the total stock market ETF, VTI. And before I give out too much right away, this fund seeks to track the performance of stocks in the materials sector, which includes companies that extract or process raw materials. Most people think of ETFs that have Apple, Microsoft, or Amazon, all these tech companies, in order to achieve high returns. Well, with this fund, there's only 115 stocks, but its top companies consist of Lind, Sherwin-Williams, and Air Products and Chemicals. Let's just be honest and look at this list. The top 10 companies, how much do you actually know about them compared to the top 10 that are in the total stock market ETF, VTI? And something else I find really cool about this is that the sectors are much different than what you're used to, because this fund has specialty chemicals and industrial gases as the top two, and that is at 26.2 and 20.9%. Now, this fund has an expense ratio of 0.1% with a current dividend yield of 1.57%. But what I love about this one is you're probably expecting it to have the worst performance over its history compared to all the other funds discussed in this video. But remember the total international fund I discussed earlier and how it was so great for diversification with no overlap with VTI? Well, its average annual return over the past 10 years was 5%. Well, with this fund, the Vanguard Materials ETF VAW, it has averaged an annual return over the past 10 years of nearly 10%. That means you're improving exposure tremendously, just like you are with the international stock ETF, but you're getting much better returns. Now, I want to emphasize how this fund and many others I'm discussing in the short term might not perform well. You can see right here that the previous month end was a 3.81% return for vol, and that the 3-month end was a 7.64%. You have to remember that these funds I'm showing you in this video are meant for holding long term, because that is when you can truly see the results that should, not guarantee, come in the future. Now, I know there's many out there that are saying that's too much tech or there's just too much risk. Well, that is a personal preference, and I'm willing to take on this risk because of how they performed and what I believe they can continue to do in the future 10, 15, 20 years plus. And like I said, this is just to make you aware and give you information on the types of things that are out there in the markets for you to potentially look into even further. So with that being said, let's now go over a simple portfolio using these 6 ETFs I've showed you in this video that would have generated you a 13% average annual return depending on how you allocate them. So the first one is going to be the total stock market ETF VTI, that for this example will contain 50% of the portfolio. Next is going to be the total international ETF VXUS, that will have 10%, and then consumer discretionary ETF VCR, that will also have 10%, as will the information tech ETF VGT, and the high dividend yield ETF VYM, and lastly the materials ETF, all split equally with 10%. Now, how difficult does that seem to start? If you had $10,000, you could put $5,000 into VTI and $1,000 in the rest of them. Now, please understand this is just an example and not something that I am telling you to do, but after analyzing the data from January 2012 to July 2023, which is just over 11 years, it would have generated a 13.33% CAGR, which is compound annual growth rate, which is really good. And basically what this portfolio would have done is turn $10,000 in 2012 into over $42,000 by 2023, while the max drawdown, which is the worst performance it saw, which it states was January to September, that drawdown was 25%. That's not that bad, seriously. Now, this is something I found extremely interesting and really wanted to share with you, so if you want to try this out on your own and create your own portfolio, I'll leave a link to the website that is free to use in the description of this video. On top of that, I'm also going to leave links to relevant content that I've created on YouTube that I think you could greatly benefit from. And if you're interested to see the content I write every week, consider joining my free Money Talk Monday newsletter. All those links are in the description of this video, and if you have any questions at all, let me know in the comment section below. Don't forget to hit the like, subscribe, and notifications button for future Money Talk content like this.